Poor souls." He went silent, and I thought for a second he was about to weep. Then he pushed himself briskly off the wall. "What am I thinking about? Do I have no manners? I must offer you water. See, my cistern." He gestured proudly towards a wooden barrel that stood just outside the cave mouth, and which was placed to catch the water that cascaded off the quarry's sides during rainstorms. He had a ladle with which he filled 2 wooden cups with water. "The barrel and ladle came from a fishing boat that was wrecked here. When? Let me see. 2 years ago? Poor people. 3 men and 2 boys. One man tried to swim away and was drowned, and the other 2 died under a hail of stones. And the 2 boys were carried off. You can imagine what happened to them. There may be women aplenty, but a clean young fisher boy's flesh is a rare treat on this isle." He put the cup in front of me and shook his head. "It is a terrible place, my friend, and you have been foolish to come here." "Or were you sent?" "I came by choice." "Then you belong here anyway, for you're plainly mad." He drank his water. "Tell me," he said, "the news of Britain." I told him. He had heard of Uther's death and Arthur's coming, but not much else. He frowned when I said King Mordred was maimed, but was pleased when he heard that Bedwyn still lived. "I like Bedwyn," he said. "Liked, rather. We have to learn to talk here as though we were dead. He must be old." "Not so old as Merlin." "Merlin lives?" he asked in surprise. "He does." "Dear me, so Merlin is alive." He seemed pleased. "I once gave him an eagle stone, and he was so grateful. I have another here somewhere. Where now?" He searched among a small pile of rocks and scraps of wood that made a collection beside the cave door. "Is it over there?" He pointed towards the bed curtain. "Can you see it?" I turned away to look for the precious rattling stone, and the moment I looked away, Maldin leapt on my back and tried to drag his small knife's ragged edge across my throat. "I'll eat you!" he cried in triumph. "Eat you!" But I had somehow caught his knife hand with my left and managed to keep the blade away from my windpipe. He wrestled me to the floor and tried to bite my ear. He was slavering above me, his appetite whetted by the thought of new, clean, human flesh to eat. I hit him once, twice, managed to twist around and bring up my knee, then hit him again. But the wretch had remarkable strength, and the sound of our fight brought more men running from other caves. I had only a few seconds before I would be overpowered by the newcomers, and so I gave one last desperate heave, then butted Maldin's head with mine and finally threw him off. I kicked him away, scrambled desperately back from the onrush of his friends, then stood in the entrance to his bedchamber, where I at last had room to draw Howlbane. The hermit shrank away from the sword's bright blade. Maldin, his mouth bleeding, lay at the side of the cave. "Not even a scrap of fresh liver?" he begged me. "Just a morsel, please." I left him. The other hermits plucked at my cloak as I passed through the quarry, but none tried to stop me. One of them laughed as I left. "You'll have to come back," the man called to me, "and we'll be hungrier then." "Eat Maldin," I told them bitterly. I climbed to the isle's ridge, where gorse grew among rocks. I could see from the summit that the great rock hill did not extend all the way to the isle's southern tip, but fell steeply to a long plain that was hatched by a tangle of ancient stone walls, evidence that ordinary men and women had once lived on the isle, and farmed the stony plateau that sloped towards the sea. There were settlements still on the plateau, the homes, I supposed, of the sea folk. A group of those dead souls watched me from their cluster of round huts that stood at the hill's base, and their presence persuaded me to stay where I was and wait for dawn. Life creeps slow in the early morning, which is why soldiers like to attack in the first light, and why I would search for my lost Nimue when the mad denizens of the isle were still sluggish and bemused with sleep. It was a hard night, a bad night. The stars wheeled above me, bright homes from where the spirits look down on feeble earth. I prayed to Bel, begging for strength, and sometimes I slept, though every rustle of grass or fall of stone brought me wide awake. I had sheltered in a narrow crack of rock that would restrict any attack, and as a result I was confident I could protect myself, though only Bel knew how I would ever leave the isle, or whether I would ever find my Nimue. I crept from my rock niche before the dawn. A fog hung over the sea beyond the sullen turmoil that marked the entrance of Cruachan's cave, and a weak grey light made the isle look flat and cold. I could see no one as I walked downhill. The sun had still not risen as I entered the first small village of crude huts. Yesterday, I had decided, I had been too timid with the isle's denizens. Today, I would treat the dead like the carrion they were. The huts were wattle and mud, thatched with branches and grass. I kicked in a ramshackle wooden door, stooped inside the hut and grabbed the first sleeping form I found. I hurled that creature outside, kicked another, then slashed a hole in the roof with Howlbane. Things that had once been human untangled themselves and slithered away from me. I kicked a man in the head, slapped another with the flat of Howlbane's blade, then dragged a third man out into the sickly light. I threw him to the ground, put my foot on his chest, and held Howlbane's tip at his throat. "I seek a woman named Nimue," I said. He stammered gibberish at me. He could not speak, or rather he could only talk in a language of his own devising, and so I left him and ran after a woman who was limping into the bushes. She screamed as I caught her, and screamed again as I placed the steel at her throat. "Do you know a woman called Nimue?" She was too terrified to speak. Instead, she lifted her filthy skirts and offered me a toothless leer, so I slapped her face with the flat of the sword's blade. "Nimue!" I shouted at her. "A girl with one eye called Nimue. Do you know her?" The woman still could not speak, but she pointed south, jabbing her hand towards the isle's seaward tip in a frantic effort to make me relent. I took the sword away and kicked the skirts back over her thighs. The woman scrambled away into a patch of thorns. The other frightened souls stared from their huts as I followed the path south towards the churning sea. I passed 2 other tiny settlements, but no one tried to stop me now. I had become part of the Isle of the Dead's living nightmare, a creature in the dawn with naked steel. I walked through fields of pale grass, dotted with birdsfoot trefoil, blue milkwort, and the crimson spikes of orchids, and told myself I should have known that Nimue, a creature of Manawydan's, would have found her refuge as close to the sea as she could find it. The isle's southern shore was a tangle of rocks, edging a low cliff. Great waves crashed into foam, sucked through gullies and shattered white into clouds of spray. The cauldron swirled and spat offshore. It was a summer morning, but the sea was grey like iron, the wind was cold, and the seabirds loud with laments. I jumped from rock to rock, going down towards that deathly sea. My ragged cloak lifted in the wind as I turned around a pillar of pale stone to see a cave that lay a few feet above the dark line of oarweed and bladderwrack, stranded by the highest tides. A ledge led to the cave, and on the ledge were piled the bones of birds and animals. The piles had been made by human hands, for they were regularly spaced, and each heap was braced by a careful latticework of longer bones and topped by a skull. I stopped, fear surging in me like the surge of the sea, as I stared at the refuge as close to the sea as any place could be on this isle of doomed souls. "Nimue!" I called as I summoned the courage to approach the ledge. "Nimue!" I climbed to the narrow rock platform and walked slowly between the heaped bones. I feared what I would find in the cave. "Nimue!" I called. Beneath me a wave roared across a spur of rock and clawed white fingers towards the ledge. The water fell back and drained in dark sluices to the sea, before another roller thundered on the headland stone and across the glistening rocks. The cave was dark and silent. "Nimue?" I said again, my voice faltering. The cave's mouth was guarded by two human skulls that had been forced into niches, so that their broken teeth grinned into the moaning wind either side of the entrance. "Nimue!" There was no answer, except for the wind's howl and the birds' laments and the suck and shudder of the ghastly sea. I stepped inside. It was cold in the cave, and the light was sickly. The walls were damp. The shingle floor rose in front of me and forced me to stoop beneath the roof's heavy loom as I stepped cautiously forward. The cave narrowed and twisted sharply to the left. A third yellowing skull guarded the bend, where I waited as my eyes settled to the gloom. Then I turned past the guardian skull to see the cave dwindling towards a dead, dark end. And there, at the cave's dark limit, she lay, my Nimue. I thought at first she was dead, for she was naked and huddled with her dark hair filthy across her face, and with her thin legs drawn up to her breasts, and her pale arms clutching her shins. Sometimes, in the green hills, we would risk the barrow whites to dig into the grassy mounds and seek the old people's gold, and we would find their bones in just such a huddle as they crouched in the earth to fend off the spirits through all eternity. Nimue? I was forced to go on hands and knees to crawl the last few feet to where she lay. Nimue, I said again. This time her name caught in my throat, for I was sure she must be dead. But then I saw her ribs move. She breathed, but was otherwise still as death. I put Howlbane down and reached a hand to touch her cold white shoulder. Nimue. She sprang towards me, hissing, teeth bared, one eye a livid red socket, and the other turned so that only the white of its eyeball showed. She tried to bite me, she clawed at me, she keened a curse in a whining voice, then spat it at me, and afterwards she slashed her long nails at my eyes. Nimue! I yelled. She was spitting, drooling, fighting and snapping with filthy teeth at my face. Nimue! She screamed another curse, and put her right hand at my throat. She had the strength of the mad, and her scream rose in triumph as her fingers closed on my windpipe. Then, suddenly, I knew just what I had to do. I seized her left hand, ignored the pain in my throat, and laid my own scarred palm across her scar. I laid it there. I left it there. I did not move. And slowly, the right hand at my throat weakened. Slowly her good eye rolled so that I could see my love's bright soul once more. She stared at me, and then she began to cry. Nimue, I said, and she put her arms around my neck and clung to me. She was sobbing now, in great heaves that racked her thin ribs as I held her, stroked her, and spoke her name. The sobs slowed and at last ended. She hung on my neck for a long time. Then I felt her head move. "Where's Merlin?" she asked in a small child's voice. "Here in Britain," I said. "Then we must go." She took her arms from around my neck and settled on her haunches so she could stare into my face. "I dreamed that you'd come," she said. "I do love you," I said. I'd not meant to say it, even if it was true. "That's why you came," she said, as though it were obvious. "Do you have any clothes?" I asked. "I have your cloak," she said. "I need nothing else except your hand." I crawled out of the cave, sheathed Howlbane and wrapped my green cloak around her pale, shivering body. She pushed an arm through a rent in the cloak's ragged wool, and then, her hand in mine, we walked between the bones and climbed the hill to where the sea folk watched. They parted as we reached the cliff's top, and did not follow as we walked slowly down the isle's eastern side.